Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Make her complexion like peaches and cream. Give her two lips like roses and clover. Then tell me that my lonesome nights are over. Sandman.
Jacob, it's about your kids. Oh my God, what are you talking about? You need to go back to the future. What the fuck?
Oh, thank God it was just a dream. Oh, thank God it was just a dream. Oh, fuck. Oh, not high school anymore, thank God. Oh, yo. Let me ask you a question. Your favorite movie, TV show, book, album, whatever it is it still your favorite without any sort of personal attachment to it? Just from a pure critical look, is it still your favorite?
This is a question that I've wrestled with when it comes to me reevaluating things in my more educated views, so to speak. We've all had those moments where you engage in something that you liked as a kid, and afterwards you don't exactly feel the same as you did when you watched it as a kid. For example, back when I was a dumb teenager, I thought Sword Art Online was really cool. And now I realize it's dog shit. I avoided MCO because I thought emo bands were dumb, and then now I proudly own several t-shirts of them. I avoided SpongeBob as well when I was a preteen, and then I ended up making a 40-plus minute video all about the first movie. And then there's a film series that's so deeply personal to me that's kind of hard for me to remove any kind of personal bias I have towards its films. I'm of course talking about Back to the Future, a film series that contains probably some of my favorite films of all time.
Roads? Where we're going, we don't need roads.
Yes, Back to the Future. The film franchise that originally started off as a hypothetical question that Bob Gale had when he was looking through his father's yearbook, but eventually morphed into a multi-million-dollar franchise that spawned several theme park attractions, video games, comics, and God knows what else. Me personally, I think Back to the Future Part 1 is one of my favorite films of all time. It used to be my favorite film of all time, but I'm kind of debating that since then. And I still have a pretty strong love for the sequels. I don't think they're as good as Part 1, but there's a lot to love about Parts 2 and 3. Now, with that being said though, a lot of my love for it is based around the nostalgia I have for it. And so, one of the things I want to do with this retrospective, especially since its 40th anniversary is just around the corner, is take a critical look at these films and ask the question, do they still hold up to my standards? You know, beyond the nostalgia I have for them. The bias, if you will. And I should note, this won't be by any means a be-all end-all dissection of Back to the Future as a whole. No, instead, this is just going to be my personal retrospective on the trilogy, and asking the question, do these films still hold up in my eyes? And so, might as well start from the first film, so let's travel back to 1985 and take a look at Back to the Future Part 1, or just Back to the Future, and see if it holds up. Along with the other films. But you kinda knew it. Look at the fucking title.
We're sending you back to the future.
Marty McFly is an average teenager. He has a girlfriend named Jennifer and a somewhat sad home life. One that features a failing marriage between his parents, George, a pushover who is constantly bullied by his supervisor, longtime enemy, Biff Tannen, and his alcoholic mother, Lorraine, alongside his siblings, Dave and Linda, otherwise known as Not Marty and Not Gold Marty. One night, his friend and resident scientist, Dr. Emmett Brown, calls him to show him his latest invention, a time-traveling car known as the DeLorean, which was a really funny joke in 1985, but now of course most people lost the context of said joke. But you can't just power a time machine with gasoline or electricity. No. Instead, Doc decides to use plutonium to power the DeLorean. How does he get it? well, you can't just buy plutonium from every corner drugstore on the street, so instead he steals some from some Libyan terrorists that he agreed to build a bomb for, which turns out to be a fake. I'm sure this won't bite him in the ass at all. Whoops, I guess it does! Get fucked! Due to some shenanigans with the terrorists in question, Modi manages to travel to 1955, encountering the younger versions of both Doc, Biff, and his parents. And now he has to find a way to get back to 1985 after the DeLorean stops working. But to add to the stress, he also has to manage to get his parents to fall in love with each other, as his future mother now has the hots for her future son, which can potentially cause him and his siblings to stop existing.
You're my mom, but you're so,
Accidental incest is my favorite. Anyways, let's talk about the characters.
The cast of Back to the Future is probably its strongest aspect. Leah Thompson, the actor who plays Lorraine, does a great job. She is so fucking giddy over the idea of Modi, which, as uncomfortable as it is, creates some damn funny moments. The scene where she sits next to Modi at the dinner table is a particular highlight for me, as her body language shows just how fucking horny she is. And George McFly is no slouch either. I would argue that Christopher Glover steals the show here. He plays the geeky loser type perfectly, mainly with that weird little nerdy voice he uses.
Stories. Science fiction stories about, visitors coming down to Earth from other planets.
His vibe is the perfect clash with Modi, a weak, geeky little guy who gets help from the cool, cocky stranger. And his whole arc of learning to stand up for himself, namely against Biff, is executed pretty well. You see him throughout the film trying to get there, even if Modi often has to come in to save him, and then finally, when he lands that punch on Biff to save Lorraine, it's such a rewarding moment. Speaking of, god damn is Thomas F. Wilson great here. I would argue across the whole trilogy, he might just be the MVP. Here, while a lot of his characterization just kind of reads as sleazy asshole, that's all you really need from him in my opinion. At least in regards to this film, where they didn't know it was supposed to be a whole trilogy. He exists to be an obstacle for our main characters, and while I don't feel like he's as funny or even nearly as threatening compared to his later appearances, I still found Biff to be an entertaining character. The scenes at the diner with George is iconic for a reason. His delivery is impeccable. And then there's Modi and Doc. My god, did they cast the two perfect people for these roles or what? Well, actually originally they didn't, at least for Modi, but that's besides the point. We'll get into that in a short bit. Doc has this frantic and chaotic energy surrounding him that makes any scene with him a joy. I'm not sure if overreacting or overacting would be the right word, but it's what comes to my mind. Specifically, the facial expressions that he makes and the way he reacts to most things featured. It reminds me of someone who is constantly anxious and panics way too much. That one moment when his younger self interacts with Modi for the first time is a perfect example of this. The exaggerated performance of Christopher Lloyd alongside Michael J. Fox's comparably more calm and collected demeanor creates a great duo for us to focus on. Modi is presented as the ideal young person, laid back and has a certain swagger that his father lacks. But that almost goes away once he travels back in time, as while he maintains some of that, a lot of it is traded in for a performance that shows just how terrified that not only is it a period that he doesn't recognize nor is familiar with, but he's also scared that he will just stop existing.
Which is all the more interesting when you remember that Eric Stoltz, the actor who originally played Marty McFly, was fired midway through production for taking a more dramatic approach to the film rather than the comedic version of Marty that we got. Now, it's not to say that Doc or Marty can't have their dramatic or serious moments. Far from it, in fact.
Specifically, there's this one moment near the end of the second act of the film when Marty tries to tell Doc about his death. But Doc keeps going on and on about how knowing he's going to live for another 3 decades and make a time machine gives him hope. Years of hard work and trial and error finally validated his time spent on the experiments. And he, of course, doesn't want to find out anything else that happens to him due to its possible effects.
It's going to be really hard waiting 30 years before I can talk to you about everything that's happened in the past few days. I'm really going to miss you, Marty.
really gonna miss you.
But understandably, Marty wants to, because he doesn't want to go back to a time when he knows that his friend is dead. You can see how gutted he is when he realizes that his best friend won't make it past that fateful night in 1985. Of course, Doc eventually does find out about him being shot thanks to a letter Marty gives him, and that kind of ties into a universal theme between all of the films, but namely the first one. Destiny, or rather, lack thereof. These characters were supposed to have arguably more miserable lives than what they wanted, but by going against their supposed destinies and making choices for the better, it allows them to live more successful and happier lives. George is the best example of this. When we first see him, he is a pushover who's in the middle of a failing marriage, but by the end, he manages to have a much more healthier relationship with Lorraine and overcome his fear of rejection to become a renowned sci-fi writer. And that comes from his actions in the past that led him to where he is by the end. This also applies to Doc. When we first find him, he is surrounded by failure experiment after failure experiment, but after seeing that he finally made something truly revolutionary, he has a newfound hope for not only himself, but for the future as a whole. And while initially he refuses to read the letter for fear of what it will cause, it's later shown to us that he did in fact read it and thus survived the terrorist attack. Again, a character's actions that lead to a better future because, while Doc is aware it could lead to dire consequences, and something that admittedly doesn't entirely make sense given his later concerns about Marty knowing too much about his own future, he knows he can change his fate, and that by extension, his destiny is his own. Another thing I noticed about the film upon rewatching is just how good a lot of the cinematography is. Of course, there's the classic scenes with the introduction of the DeLorean and the chase scene, both of which are executed perfectly, namely with the DeLorean introduction as it has this perfect sense of tension and mystery surrounding it. But there's also the clock tower scene with Christopher Lloyd acting his ass off and paired with some great camera angles that highlight the danger Doc is in, along with the amazing ending shot of Doc seeing the DeLorean travel through time. The Mr. Sandman scene where Marty enters 1955 Hill Valley for the first time features some great crane and tracking shots. But I would argue what helps elevate these scenes is not just the camera work or the acting, but the music. Alan Silvestri fucking cooked with these scores. Of course, you have the iconic theme, which feels so adventurous and exciting, but you also have the more tenso moments, like the scenes in which Biff tries to rape Lorraine. Did I mention some of these films are kind of uncomfortable in hindsight? Marty's letter to Doc has this great somber variant of the Back to the Future theme, which is later reused in the next two films. The orchestral score does a pretty good job in highlighting the fantastical, exciting moments in the film. Plus, hey, you got some kick-ass Huey Lewis and the News songs in there. One even mentions the characters that are in the movie despite featuring said song in the trilogy not once, but twice. That don't think too hard about that. Anyways, the movie ends with Marty returning home, Doc surviving the bullet via a bulletproof vest he used after reading the letter, and Marty's life is completely different as his family is more successful, richer, and everything is better now. Until Doc comes in and tells Marty and Jennifer to come to the DeLorean with him, as it's about their kids. Doc says the line that ended up being referenced in the State of the Union address the following year, and the film ends.
I love Back to the Future Part 1. It's still one of my favorite films of all time, regardless of my personal attachment to it. It has a damn near perfect cast, amazing writing, amazing score. It's just such a fun film that I can go back and watch anytime and still enjoy as much as I did the first time. And audiences clearly felt the same way as well, as not only did it do amazing at the box office in a time when box office numbers were historically down, but also won multiple awards and, of course, spawned a huge fan base that loves anything Back to the Future related. And also, most notably, it spawned 2 sequels that were... okay, look, Parts 2 and 3 are great. I still like them. But they're not on the same level as Part 1. They're not even close in my opinion. They're not unwatchable or anything, but they're just kind of okay, they're good, but like, not as good as part 1.
Universal was all in for making one of their biggest hits of the decade into a trilogy. So much so that, rather infamously, they shot parts 2 and 3 back-to-back in a hectic production that rivaled the chaos of the set of the first film after they fired the lead actor. It was a huge gamble for Bob Gale and company, especially since not only did Crispin Glover not want to appear in the films for a few reasons, namely pay disputes and some disagreements with the story, which also led to a lawsuit after they reused some footage of him without his permission, and Claudia Wells, who played Jennifer in the first film, not being able to return due to poster matters, and thus being recasted with Elizabeth Shue filling in.
The 11-month productions of parts 2 and 3 were pretty stressful for all parties involved, but at least Universal, and therefore Bob Gale and company, were pretty sure that they had success on their hands. And while yes, Back to the Future's parts 2 and 3 didn't meet as big financial expectations as part 1 did, they did still do pretty good for Universal's expectations. Which is all the more surprising when you remember that part 2 kinda sucks.
Okay, that's a bit unfair to it. There's lots to like about Back to the Future Part 2. You still have a great cast, an arguably more interesting plot, some amazing set designs, and we're turning to compose this and the next film, an amazing score by Alan Silvestri. In fact, fuck it, I want to talk about this now. Part 2 has one of my favorite scores in any movie, period. Many of the tracks take the musical cues from Part 1's score, but there is a healthy amount of original tracks throughout the film. In fact, unlike Part 1, which has several licensed songs from the 50s making up its back half, most of the tracks from Part 2 are original. Part 2 has the best soundtrack out of all three, with scores that range from exciting to heartfelt to tense, and that's needed when you have a plot that's somewhat perplexing for our audience at the time and even now.
Here's something I noticed when I was doing my research for this. Part 2 didn't nearly have as good as an audience reaction as Part 1 did, or even Part 3 for that matter. Now, of course, a part of that is probably just due to the fact that sequels almost never get as good as a success as their counterparts do. But a large part of that was due to the film's more darker tone, at least according to Bob Gale in a 2018 interview. Because Part 2, at least in comparison to Parts 1 and Parts 3, is a lot more darker than I feel like people remember.
In a reshot opening with a new Jennifer actor, Doc takes Marty and Jen to the future, the distant year of 2015.
Yeah, that checks out.
And then Doc puts Jen to sleep with a device because she was asking too many questions.
Then what did you bring her for?
I had to do something. She saw a time machine. I couldn't just leave her there without information.
Yeah, because lifting off in the middle of a suburban neighborhood won't raise any questions.
What the hell is going on here?
Oops again! To sidetrack here, 2015 is pretty cool, especially design-wise. Obviously, there's a lot of parody, both in the funny kind and the other reading of parody, in the contents of the town, but there was an era of cynicism, I want to say, towards the future. Maybe that's not the right word. Taking the piss out of it is probably better. Instead of trying to actually predict what would be in the future, they just opted for the, hey, you know what would be cool? Or, hey, imagine if this would happen? Or, more accurately, you know what would be funny? Method of portraying the future. Everyone is in these big, flashy, brightly colored outfits. The old clock tower is changed to a mall. Robots do most of the work. Lawyers have been completely abolished so life sentences can be dished out in a matter of 2 hours. Jesus Christ, that sounds terrifying. And the one thing this movie sadly did predict shockingly well, AI copies of dead people becoming your waiter. But back to the plot, Marty helps his future son get out of a heist put on by Griff's gang, Biff's grandson, that would have ruined his family's future. After an impressive chase scene with a hoverboard, Marty buys a sports book with records leading up all the way to the year 2000, which Doc refuses to let him bring back, citing his desire to never let the DeLorean be used for financial gain. Unfortunately for them, Jennifer, who's left in an alley by Doc after putting her to sleep, is brought to a future home by the police. So now Doc and Marty need to save her as well. It's here where we realize that, 1, everyone is played by Michael J. Fox. Dear God, this is terrifying. But it's also here where we realize that Marty and Jen's future isn't what it's cracked up to be. For one, Marty's aspirations of being a rock star have been dashed. According to the film, in 1985, Marty was goaded into a drag race by his classmate Needles, and as a result, he crashed his car, injured his hand, and was sued by the driver. Jennifer allegedly married him to pity Marty, and that led to his family becoming the mirror image of what the McFlys were originally pre-tripped in 1955. And most alarming of all, Marty gets goaded again by Needles, now his co-worker, into a shady business deal that leads to Marty getting fired in what is admittedly the funniest way possible.
Read my
No!
facts.
Please, no, I cannot be fired. I'm fired.
However, doing all of this, the Biff we know steals the DeLorean, travels back to 1955 to give his younger self the sports book, and causes all hell to break loose, as upon turning to 1985, Biff is now ultra rich, and Hill Valley is now turned into something akin to Pottersville from It's a Wonderful Life, just on steroids. We also find out that he killed George McFly as a form of revenge in the early 70s, and forced Lorraine to marry him. Also, Nixon gets a knife torn, what the fuck? As a result, Marty and Doc must go back to 1955 to stop Biff from getting the sports book, while also not running into the past selves for fear of destroying the universe, and then destroy the DeLorean to avoid a mistake like this from ever happening again. So, a couple of things. Firstly, how the fuck did Biff manage to become this powerful without anyone noticing it? I can see him getting away with murdering George and marrying Lorraine without an issue. Biff admits to later buying off the police, so I can see him getting away with that, but you would think some sort of form of government would notice this, right? And it's not like all Biff did was become rich and acted like even more of an asshole than before. His actions caused Marty's high school to be burnt down by vandals, his neighborhood to be turned into a crime-filled hellhole in which shootouts occur often, and turned Hill Valley into some sort of personal military-controlled zone. Police being on Biff's payroll or not, someone would have had to notice shit was going down in Hill Valley, right?
Secondly, Part 2 is much more of a downer compared to Parts 1 and Parts 3. Now, of course, Part 1 did have its fair share of grim moments. I mean, the whole conflict of the film is if Marty McFly is going to just stop existing, and that's kind of terrifying when you think about it for even more than a few seconds. But Part 2, even before we get to the alternate 1985 bits, is way more darker in comparison. If Part 1 represented the optimism towards making choices for the better and choosing your own destiny, then Part 2 is the inverse of that, making choices for the worse and seeing how it affects the world around you. And I'll be honest, that's a lot more of a better hook than just, "It's about your kids, Marty," that we had at the end of Part 1. It adds stakes to it, and I feel like you need that for a sequel.
But then we get to the bigger issue. After Doc and Marty realize they need to go back to 1955, the rest of the movie is just not that interesting. It's just Marty and Doc following 1955 Biff, which does include some funny moments, not to mention impressive shots that often feature the younger and older versions of the characters sharing the screen, but it's just a condensed version of the first film. We do get the addition of a pretty kick-ass chase scene with 1955 Biff and Marty, but the lackluster third act killed most of my interest in the film after the fact. Admittedly, this is one of the things that might just be a factor in how much has changed since the first film was supposed to be a one and done, and, well, the world that we live in now having the 3 Back to the Future films.
There was a 4-year gap between the releases of Parts 1 and Parts 2. Back we only had a Laserdisc and VHS releases. So, when audiences of 1989 got to see these moments of a beloved film be reenacted in a new light for this new film, it was pretty novel at the time. But in a day and age where Back to the Future is so accessible, to the point where, let's be fair here, if you turn on your cable box, you'll probably find Back to the Future airing somewhere, these scenes just kinda don't have as much as an impact as they originally did.
It's unfortunate because the best thing about these scenes is Thomas F. Wilson stealing the show. The loss of George McFly being an active presence, alongside Lorraine and Jennifer being mostly afterthoughts in the grand scheme of things in both this and the next film, meant that someone needed to be the guy who Marty and Doc interact with for more than just a quick gag. meaning that all the variants of Biff played from the 1955 rough bully we knew in Part 1 to the old and cranky Biff we see in 2015, the cold, cunning alternative 1985 Biff, and the hammy as all hell Griff are all highlights of the film. Of course, Doc and Marty are still great as ever, their performances are about as on par as last time, but they aim for a lot more of a goofy performance compared to their previous film, and I think a lot of that is what defines this movie, goofy. Not in a bad way, its silliness leans a lot more towards the comedy elements that became a central part of its first film, and while that slightly becomes a problem when the movie goes to a more darker approach to its storytelling, I don't feel like it's out of character, especially when the first film had a number of those moments as well. It's very tongue-in-cheek, even in the moment when it's supposed to be a bit more serious than it normally is. But of course, with our audience knowing it's the second act of a trilogy, our story just doesn't end with Marty getting the sports book back. After destroying the book so that alternate 1985 never exists, Doc arrives to pick him back up and travel back to their 1985. But when he does, lightning strikes the DeLorean, sending Doc back in time. Afterwards, a Western Union worker gives Marty a telegram written by Doc, saying that he is living happily in 1885 after being struck by lightning. But Marty knows he can't just leave his best friend stranded in the Old West, so he runs back to 1955 Doc and tells him he needs to go back to the past. We end with a teaser for Back to the Future Part 3, coming in summer 1990.
Three fucking rules. I used to hate it as a kid, but now I actually really like it. And I think large part of that is actually because I feel like it's a lot more focused in comparison to Part 2. Part 2 you shuffled around a lot between different time periods, but Part 3 is mostly set in 1885. Thus meaning it's a much more unique film, as these characters basically have none of the resources that they had previously. Even in 1955, there was still some sort of form of technology that they could work with, but here in 1885, pretty much nothing for the better part of the film.
But of course, there needs to be some sort of setup in how Marty gets there. Upon rereading the letter Doc gave to Marty at the end of Part 2, they find the location of the DeLorean in an old mining facility, in which they also find Doc's grave. As it turns out, Doc was killed in a duel by the hands of Mad Dog Tannen, Biff's ancestor from the Wild West, which was referenced in Part 2. So now Marty has a new mission: save Doc from Biff and return home safely. Once he does, not only is he introduced to his ancestors, Maggie and Seamus McFly, but later him and Doc are introduced to Clara, a school teacher who falls in love with Doc. And of course, Mad Dog Tannen, who, after a handful of encounters with the gang including at Ye Old Under the Sea Dance featuring cameos by ZZ Top, Tannen challenges Marty to a duel which causes him to essentially take the place of Doc.
Like I said, we'll finish this tomorrow.
Tomorrow we're robbing the Pan City stage.
What about Monday? We doing anything Monday?
No, Monday be fine. You can kill him on Monday.
I'll be back this way on Monday.
All while they need to find a way to escape 1885.
Outside of the Western aesthetic, I feel like the big thing Part 3 has going for it is its action scenes, which I would argue are some of the best in the entire franchise. Particularly when Doc rescues Clara, Tannen's scrap with Marty, and of course the train heist scene, which I will say takes the cake for the best in the entire franchise. Tell me when I'm telling lies, goddammit.
The train scene in particular features Marty and Doc running across the train in this really impressive sequence, along with Doc and Clara scurrying across the train in a callback to the Part 1 with that amazing tense score. It really does feel like an appropriate action-packed climax for the end of the franchise, but we're getting a bit too ahead of ourselves. Speaking of, while I wish we got to see more of Clara, she does manage to be a really fun character. She's more assertive compared to Jennifer or Lorraine, as she's one of the few people to tell Biff off during the dance. Not to mention, when she thinks Doc is bullshitting about him being a time traveler, she's willing to dress him down pretty brutally.
I understand that because you know I'm partial to the writings of Jules Verne, you concocted those mendacities in order to take advantage of me.
But sadly, she is a bit of an afterthought, which is kind of a problem with how every woman has been written not named Lorraine McFly. But hey, she and Doc make for a cute couple, and I legitimately think they have a great chemistry together. Doc's character in Part 2 never really had anything going for him besides being a guide for Modi, so it's great to see him getting an arc like this, which provides some great drama. Stay in the past with Clara, or return home in the time that he was supposed to be in. But again, we don't see much of that, as a lot of it is focused on 1. Mad Dog Tannen being a ruthless bastard, and 2. Finding a way to get back to 1985.
I feel like Part 3 really could have cemented itself as the best film in the franchise in terms of an emotional level if they focused a lot more on Doc grappling between his emotions and what the logical thing to do is. He's happy in 1885. He has a beautiful girlfriend, and he seems to be really enjoying the whole blacksmith thing. He has no reason to leave 1885. In fact, if you remember at the end of Part 2, he explicitly tells Modi to not worry about him and to travel back to 1985 without him. Now, of course, Doc is a very logical person, so he feels like he should return back to that period. But there's clear tension between if he should stay with Clara in 1885 or go back to 1985 in his own time period. Again, I really wish the film focused a lot more on it, and thankfully it does more than originally I remembered it doing, but still.
Doc is always somebody who tries to do things the logical way, which is why he initially refused to read the letter in Part 1. So having him deal with something that causes an emotional divide would be a great way to shake things up. As for Modi... Look, I'm not gonna lie, Part 3 is Doc's story, start to finish. Modi's big conflict here was the duel with Tannen and finally learning to pick his battles, which is kind of a moot point since he's forced to fight Tannen anyways. Outside of that, he takes a backseat to Doc's arc for most of the film. And, well, that does kind of stink, especially since it's the last time Michael J. Fox will reprise his role in any of the Back to the Future sequels or expanded media. This is ultimately something that stings a lot less when, again, Doc never really got a full character arc after Part 1. Mad Dog Tannen, however, God, is he great! The other Biff family members were scummy at best and slightly threatening at worst. Even alternate 1985 Biff didn't get physical until Modi found out about the sports book, and even then, that was only because he had a gun. But this Tannen? Ruthless. Right from the start, he makes an impression when he attempts to lynch Modi when they first meet. Near the end, he forces Modi into the aforementioned fight because he captures Doc, and it ends with him getting his ass kicked, but he was ready to kill Doc regardless if Modi was going to help or not. There's even a bit that was deleted from the final film where he shoots the ancestor of Mr. Strickland, Modi's principal, in cold blood. Alternate 1985 Biff was threatening because in that timeline, he won and there was nothing Modi and company could have done, if not for the DeLorean at least. But here, he's trapped and Biff is ready to strike whenever. The score is as amazing as always. A lot of it is like tracks from Part 2, but with a southern twist to things. But damn do I feel like they do a great job in the more dramatic and heartfelt sections. Especially the last act when Modi arrives back to 1985 and when he sees the DeLorean destroyed. Oh, right, I probably should get back to the plot. For Modi to travel back to the future, he and Doc needs to use a train to get the DeLorean to 88 miles per hour. The problem is, if they don't do that successfully, it could mean their deaths, as the bridge they plan on using isn't fully built yet. Doc stays back with Clara since she, unexpectedly for reasons not worth getting into, joins Doc and Modi on the train midway through. Modi successfully travels back to 1985, and immediately afterwards, accidentally destroys the DeLorean when a train comes barreling through it. After he meets with Jennifer, Modi decides to not race needles, even though he doesn't know what exactly was going to happen to him, thus causing his future to be changed for the better. But thankfully, this is not the end for Doc and Clara, as they return back to 1985 in the time train, an infinitely cooler way to travel in my opinion, and showing off their kids, Jules and Vaughn. Doc Brown fucks. And so we end the trilogy off with Modi and Jen's future being secured, and Doc and Marty telling him to make it a good one, as he flies off in the time train, ending the Back to the Future trilogy.
Your future hasn't been written yet. No one's has. Your future is whatever you make it. So make it a good one. Both of you.
We will, Doc!
But of course, that would not be the end of Back to the Future as a whole. While we would never get a Back to the Future Part 4 like many fans would want, we would get a number of side materials. For one, in 1991, there was Back to the Future, the animated series, a continuation which namely focuses on the Browns. It lasted only for 26 episodes, and I've only seen some clips from it, so I can't really fully comment on it, outside of, 1, holy shit, this was the first time we got to see Bill Nye on public television, and 2, it's about what you expect from an animated spin-off of a movie in the early 90s. That same year, Back to the Future The Ride opened in Universal Studios Florida, with a Hollywood and Japan version following in 2001 and 1993, respectively. Never got the chance to ride this, sadly. By the time I went to Universal, it was the Simpsons ride, which I must admit is pretty good, but at least I can experience it on the Blu-rays. It was pretty impressive for its time, using IMAX screens way before they became commonplace in every theater across the nation. The gist of it was that Doc founded the Institute of Future Technology and invited us, the unwilling volunteers, apparently, to test out the 8-person DeLorean. After he wanted to destroy it in the past 2 movies. Good work, Doc.
It demonstrates precisely how time travel can be misused and why the time machine must be destroyed.
Later.
The new experimental 8-passenger DeLorean time travel vehicle.
Also, in the later Blu-ray releases, there was Doc Brown Saves the World, a 9-minute short film which explained why everything is different from all 2015 compared to the movie's 2015. It's okay, nothing too special, and it contains some mediocre social commentary.
Griff Tech invents a social network that allows inanimate objects to post selfies. The kids love it.
There were several video games, a few Commodore and MSX titles, one being the source for an early AVGN episode, the others being an NES and Genesis game for parts 2 and 3, and then a Super Famicom game for part 2. I actually played this one on an emulator way back. It's pretty fun. Nice little title. And, of course, in the 2010s, we got Back to the Future, the video game, released by Telltale Games, which was pretty much Back to the Future Part 4, as it included most of the original cast, apart from Crispin Glover and Michael J. Fox, unfortunately. Again, never played this one beyond a short stint when I had it at an Xbox Live Gold membership and got this as a freebie, but hey, maybe one day I'll take a look at it. And of course, you have the IDW line of comics. I heard really good things about these books, namely that they lean a lot more of the sci-fi elements of the franchise. Unfortunately, these comics are long out of print after IDW lost the license, and I'm not paying that much for a physical copy. And most recently, a musical, which I heard absolutely nothing about. Maybe I'll make a follow-up with the Back to the Future spin-offs, but as of now, I think we're done revisiting Back to the Future. So, now that I'm a jaded, cynical adult, has the trilogy survived the passage of time? Yes! Disregarding my personal experience with Back to the Future, I still think this trilogy is great. Strong cast, amazing music, funny as hell writing, and sure, the first film does a lot of the heavy lifting.
There's that word again, heavy. Why are things so heavy in the future? Is there a problem with the Earth's gravitational pull?
Yeah, I made the joke. But there was a lot to enjoy about the others, depending on what exactly you want out of a Back to the Future sequel. If you want a darker, more sci-fi or time travel-oriented movie, then Part 2 is up your alley. If you want a more character-focused and action-driven piece, then Part 3 is what you want. If you want a mix of all of those elements, then watch Part 1 and marathon everything like I did. It's a great franchise that's an equal parts hilarious as it is heartfelt, as exciting as it is creative. Did it change the genre? Nah. But did it make an impact? Well, when an entire day is made to honor a date featured in your now 40-year-old plus franchise, I think it's fair to say that it did more than that. Our futures may not be set in stone, but the legacy of Doc, Marty, Biff, and all the others is more than cemented in my eyes. Happy 40th, Back to the Future. Now where the fuck are my flying cars?
Okay, finally done with this fucking video.
Jacob, it's about your kids.
Oh, god damn it.
You must go back to the future.
I already did this bit. I don't want to do it again.
Roads, where we're going, we don't need roads. Now get the fuck out.
No, let me in, please.
You must go back to the future. To be continued. Get out. Get the fuck out of here already. What the...
And you don't seem to understand. A shame you seem to